In December 1941, the German army stood just miles from Moscow. For months they had advanced almost without pause, crushing everything in their path. Entire Soviet armies had been surrounded, cities had fallen, millions of prisoners had been taken. To many observers, it seemed like only a matter of time before the Soviet Union collapsed. But then, in the freezing darkness of a Russian winter, something happened that no one in Berlin truly expected. The Red Army did not break. It struck back. And when it did, it shattered more than German supply lines. It shattered German confidence. Imagine being a German soldier at that moment. You had marched hundreds of miles east. You had seen victory after victory. Your commanders told you the enemy was finished. Moscow was close. The war would soon be over. And then the temperature dropped below zero. Engines froze. Weapons jammed. Frostbite spread through the ranks. And suddenly, through the snow and smoke, Soviet forces began attacking in strength. Not scattered resistance. Not desperate last stands. A coordinated counterattack. Before we go deeper into this turning point, make sure you like this video and subscribe to History Plus. If you enjoy powerful war stories told in a clear and realistic way, this channel is for you. Your support helps us bring more deep historical breakdowns like this one. By late November 1941, German forces were exhausted. Operation Barbarossa had started in June with speed and shock. The strategy was simple. Destroy the Red Army near the border, capture key cities, and force political collapse before winter. At first it worked. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Panzer divisions moved rapidly. Soviet defenses seemed disorganized. But the Soviet Union was larger than any campaign Germany had fought before. Every mile forward stretched supply lines, thinner. Fuel, ammunition, winter clothing, and spare parts had to travel across damaged roads and captured railways that were built in a different gauge. When German forces approached Moscow, they believed they were facing the final barrier. The capital was more than just a city. It was a political symbol, a transport hub, and a center of communication. If Moscow fell, many believed the Soviet system would collapse. But while Germany focused on the front lines, the Soviet leadership was reorganizing behind them. Factories were dismantled and moved east beyond the Ural Mountains. Fresh divisions were forming. Intelligence reports indicated that Japan was not preparing to attack from the east, which meant Siberian troops could be redeployed to defend Moscow. These Siberian units were trained for extreme cold. They arrived with proper winter gear, white, camouflage uniforms, and experience fighting in harsh climates. Meanwhile, many German soldiers were still wearing uniforms designed for a summer campaign. Some units wrapped blankets around their boots for warmth. Others tried to light small fires at night, risking enemy detection just to survive the cold. On December 5th and 6th, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive along a broad front near Moscow. It was not a single dramatic charge, but a coordinated push involving infantry, cavalry, artillery, and tanks. The Soviet T-34 tanks, with their wide tracks and sloped armor, performed better in snow and mud than many German vehicles. German commanders were stunned. They had believed the Red Army was close to collapse. Instead, they were facing fresh, determined forces, striking with confidence. The psychological impact was immediate. For the first time in the war against the Soviet Union, German units were being forced into retreat on a large scale. This was not a tactical withdrawal to reposition. It was a response to pressure that could not be ignored. Villages that had been captured weeks earlier were abandoned. Defensive lines were hastily constructed in freezing ground. Officers who had been planning the final push toward Moscow were now focused on preventing a deeper disaster. Communication within the German command structure became tense. Some generals requested permission to pull back to more defensible positions. They understood that holding exposed salients in extreme cold could lead to encirclement. But Adolf Hitler increasingly refused large withdrawals. He believed that standing firm would prevent panic and stabilize the front. In some cases, holding the line did prevent complete collapse. In others, it led to heavy casualties and units being overrun. For the Soviet soldiers, the counterattack carried enormous symbolic weight. Only months earlier, They had been retreating in chaos. Now they were advancing against the same enemy. That had seemed unstoppable. Civilians near Moscow had dug trenches and anti-tank ditches. They had watched smoke rise from burning villages. The sound of artillery moving westward signaled something new. Hope. Still, the Red Army paid a high price. The counteroffensive was costly. Casualties were severe. Soviet logistics were also strained. The harsh winter affected both sides. But unlike the Germans, the Soviet leadership had prepared for a long war. They understood that even pushing the enemy back a few dozen miles could change the strategic picture. It would buy time. It would prove resilience. It would show the world that Germany could be stopped. As December turned into January, German confidence continued to erode. Reports from the front described not just combat losses, but equipment failure due to cold. Lubricants thickened. Batteries died. Trucks refused to start. Horses collapsed in snow. The image of the unstoppable Blitzkrieg army began to crack under the pressure of reality. Officers who once spoke of quick victory now spoke of survival, and this is where the deeper shift occurred. The Soviet counterattack did not destroy the German army in one dramatic blow. It did something more subtle and perhaps more important. It forced Germany to confront the fact that the war in the East would not end quickly. The idea of a short campaign was over. From this moment forward, every decision would be shaped by the knowledge that the Soviet Union had endured the worst and was still fighting. On History Plus, we focus on these moments when perception changes, because wars are not only about territory, they are about belief. In 1941, Germany believed it could not be beaten in open battle. After the Soviet counterattack near Moscow, that belief was shaken. And once confidence is shaken in war, everything becomes harder. The snow continued to fall across the Eastern Front. German soldiers dug deeper trenches. Soviet units prepared for further pushes. The world watched closely. The counterattack around Moscow marked the first time Hitler's grand invasion had been pushed back in a significant way. It was not the end of the conflict. Far from it. But it was the first clear sign that the path ahead would be long, brutal, and uncertain. And as we move forward, the question becomes even more intense. How did this shattered confidence inside the German command influence their next moves? Did it make them more cautious or more desperate? In the next part, we will look deeper into how this winter shock changed German strategy and set the stage for even larger battles that would define the war in the East. When the Soviet counterattack began to push German forces back from Moscow, the shock inside the German command was deeper than many later admitted. For months, the entire strategy of the war in the East had been built on speed, aggression, and the belief that the Red Army would collapse under pressure. Now that assumption had been proven wrong in the snow outside the Soviet capital. German generals quickly understood the danger. Their front lines were stretched thin, supply routes were unreliable, and units were exhausted. Some commanders requested organized withdrawals to shorter, more defensible positions. From a purely military perspective, pulling back made sense. It would reduce exposure and allow the army to regroup. But Adolf Hitler saw retreat as weakness. He feared that once troops began falling back, panic could spread and the entire front might unravel. So instead of flexible maneuver, many units were ordered to stand fast. In some sectors, this decision prevented a complete collapse. Soldiers held defensive positions with stubborn resistance, often in brutal conditions. But in other areas, the order to hold ground at all costs led to heavy casualties. Units that might have escaped encirclement were trapped. The psychological strain grew stronger. Confidence was no longer built on rapid victories. It was replaced by survival under extreme pressure. Inside Germany, propaganda tried to frame the situation as a temporary adjustment caused by harsh weather. The winter was blamed. Logistics were blamed. But among officers and frontline soldiers, the truth was clear. The Red Army was not broken. It was adapting, reorganizing, and fighting back with determination. The idea of an easy campaign had disappeared. For the Soviet Union, this moment changed morale dramatically. The counterattack did not mean total victory, but it proved that German forces could be pushed backward. Factories relocated to the east were now producing more tanks and artillery. Fresh recruits were being trained. The war had transformed into a test of endurance, and in that kind of war, industrial strength and manpower mattered just as much as early battlefield success. Here on History Plus, we often look at how a single shift in momentum can reshape an entire conflict. The Soviet counterattack near Moscow was not just a battlefield event. It was a psychological earthquake. It forced Germany to rethink its timeline, its strategy, and its expectations. And when a war plan built on speed suddenly becomes a war of attrition, everything changes. After the winter fighting settled into a tense stalemate, the German leadership faced a hard reality. The campaign that was supposed to end in months had turned into a drawn-out struggle across thousands of miles. Confidence had not completely disappeared, but it was no longer blind. Every new plan had to consider the fact that the Red Army could recover, regroup, and strike back. In early 1942, German strategy shifted south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. The goal was clear: secure resources, weaken Soviet industry, and regain the initiative. But this new offensive was shaped by the lessons of the failed push on Moscow. Commanders were more cautious about supply lines, yet the front remained vast and difficult to control. The army was still strong, but it was no longer operating with the same unstoppable aura that defined the early months of Operation Barbarossa. For the Soviet Union, the successful counterattack became proof that endurance worked. The Red Army leadership studied its mistakes from 1941 and began improving coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. Defensive lines were strengthened. Reserves were organized more carefully. The belief that Germany could be defeated was no longer just propaganda. It was grounded in experience. Morale on both sides reflected this shift. German soldiers understood that future victories would come at a much higher cost. Soviet soldiers knew survival was possible. That balance of belief, no longer one-sided, changed the psychological landscape of the entire Eastern Front. On History Plus, we emphasize how wars are shaped not only by weapons, but by perception. Once the myth of invincibility is broken, every battle that follows carries a different weight. The Soviet counterattack near Moscow did not end the war, but it removed the illusion of certainty from German planning, and when certainty disappears, hesitation and risk grow stronger. In the final part, we will bring everything together and look at the long-term impact of this shattered confidence and why historians still debate whether this moment marked the true beginning of Germany's decline in the East. By the time spring returned in 1942, the Eastern Front looked very different from the confident advance of the previous summer. The snow had melted, but the illusion of quick victory had melted. With it, Germany still controlled vast territory. Its army was still powerful. But something fundamental had changed. The belief that the Soviet Union would collapse under pressure was gone. The winter counterattack near Moscow had done more than push back German divisions. It forced a strategic reset. From that point forward, German planning had to account for a long war of resources, manpower, and endurance. Every offensive would require deeper preparation. Every mile gained would demand more fuel, more ammunition, and more lives. The psychological advantage that once carried German forces forward was no longer automatic. Inside the German high command, debates grew sharper. Some officers recognized that overstretch had nearly led to disaster. Others believed that one decisive blow could still end the conflict. This tension would shape the decisions that followed, including the drive toward the south and eventually toward Stalingrad. But the shadow of the Moscow counterattack lingered. It was the first clear warning that the Red Army could survive and retaliate in force. For the Soviet Union, the impact was just as powerful. The successful defense of Moscow became a symbol of national resistance. It strengthened morale across the country. It proved that relocation of industry and mobilization of reserves were working. It also showed that coordinated counterattacks, even under brutal conditions, could shift momentum. The Red Army was still learning, still adapting, but it now carried confidence built on experience rather than hope. When historians look back, many see this moment as the psychological turning point of the war in the East. Not because Germany was defeated outright, but because certainty was replaced with doubt. And in large-scale war, doubt spreads quickly. Soldiers sense it, commanders feel it, nations react to it. From this stage onward, Germany was fighting not just the Soviet army, but the consequences of its own overconfidence. On History Plus, we focus on these turning points because they remind us that history rarely changes in a single dramatic explosion. Sometimes it changes in the quiet shock of a winter morning, when an army that thought it was unstoppable is suddenly forced to retreat. The Soviet counterattack near Moscow shattered German confidence in a way that no speech or propaganda could repair. As we close, think about this. If the Red Army had failed in that winter push, how different might the war have looked? Would Germany have regained its momentum, or was the scale of the Soviet Union always too vast to conquer? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective adds depth to the discussion. If you found this breakdown valuable, share this video with someone who is interested in World War II history. And if you have not already, make sure you are subscribed to History Plus for more clear, powerful storytelling about the moments that shaped our world.